Yes, let's solve
Yeah.
everything.
Let's solve it all. Mine as well, right? So that the 17 to 24 people who listen to this podcast, just spread the word. We figured it out. Whatever it is, we got it. We figured it out here. We're going to figure it out live in front of you. Okay, not live, it's recorded. Right in front of you so that you can know how to fix it. I'm alive.
We're live.
Or am I?
Hashtag you're welcome. All right. Well, I am Andy Swindler.
I am Brendan McNamara.
And today, the question of the day is white supremacy real?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a totally classic question in so many different ways.
Really, a lot to unpack there. And,
yeah, let me blast my first impression.
Well, hold on.
I'm just.
Are you going to answer the question?
I'm just going to answer the question now, and then I'll see how my answer changes in an hour. It is. I'm putting an asterisk next to that. It absolutely is real. Putting an asterisk next to that, I think the big thing we're going to end up talking about is there are certain I would consider them subsets. There are subsets of our culture presently, the culture in the United States, where white supremacy means something completely different than it is meant historically, than what it's meant for. And now people would say it's been clarified, and it's actually what it's always meant. But semantically, does white supremacy exist in the new semantic sense? But that's a long parenthetical. I'd be like, I don't know if that one exists. But does white supremacy exist, or is it real? Yes. That's where I'm starting from. But let's see. Maybe by the end of this, I'll be like, you know what? Not real. So that's my little caveat.
Got it. I'm going to just go with a simple yes, and we'll see where we land. As it's the relatively new format. We offer our answers in the beginning, then we talk and we solve everything, and then at the end we offer new answers potentially.
Yes, potentially, yeah, or maybe they're just the same, but they're same. I mean, I think this is the great thing about it, right? That even if your mind isn't fundamentally changed, that if nothing else, walking through a journey with somebody else's perspective, well, I think most of the time will change your mind. It might not fundamentally 180-degree change your mind, but I feel like every time you talk to someone who you don't agree with, your mind is changed. I mean, literally neurologically. And then I often think of it as like it shaves off sloppy edges, or it cuts. I wish I had one on my shirt. I thought I did, but like cuts the loose threads, because there's always little parts of what we think and what we think. There you go. Just kind of removes a boo-boo. Takes a little Band-Aid off.
I like the degree reference though, because if a plane is 1 degree off course, eventually just in a totally different place.
Yeah, you end up in the North Pole,
if not millions of miles away from where it started.
Yeah, as you continue, I mean, eventually you come back around to yourself, I suppose, if you circumnavigated the globe. But
wait, you don't think the Earth is round, do you?
I do think it's kind of. I mean, that's how just visually how it appears. Like, when you see on a clear day, the kind of what they refer to in the Old Testament as the firmament. On a really clear day, especially when we were younger, I feel like I saw it more. On a really clear day during the day, you could kind of see the dome. I always thought it looked kind of like a contact lens, the contact lens of the sky. I mean, to me, that's the best proof of a not flat Earth thing, unless you're saying the whole thing is like a flat circle like this, like a pizza, and then putting a dome on top of the pizza. I haven't had pizza in a while.
That's I guess it's time I break it to you that this is the Brendan Show, and
yay! I've been pranked. This has all been an elaborate prank. I thought a cool way to jump into this would be when you say white supremacy is real. Do you mean it by what I would consider, and we should see if we can even agree on that? Do you agree that there is a classic definition of white supremacy and there is a new proposed definition of white supremacy at present? Do we have the same experience of reality in that paradigm or in that definition? Meaning like a historic definition, I would say, as far as I know, until somewhere in the past, what year are we in? 20, somewhere in the past 40 plus years. Maybe 50, there's been a proposed addendum or a revised definition that hasn't really made it to all the dictionaries or whatever yet. So it's still a novel. I would consider that therefore a novel definition, but which I think a lot of people hearing this might already assume, because it's a popular one to discuss, might think that we're talking about. But I think that's how we can both say yes and actually be answering different questions with, especially with a term like this.
Yeah, I agree. We should move through some definitions. Even breaking down white and supremacy as two different definitions.
Yeah.
And there's a few different sort of versions of where white even came from. On this show, we've decided to say lightly melanated as a more scientifically accurate way to talk about that. Generally, white would refer to lightly melanated people, probably of European origin. Maybe not at this point, especially because
even like I would think classically like Northern European.
Yeah,
like I'm from, like, my people are from Ireland, like very dominantly.
I like the Jane Elliott version where it's like, yeah, we all came from Africa, and the further north we got, the more the lighter, the less melanation we needed to collect vitamin D.
Yep, like, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yep, good enough.
I'll buy that one for $1. Oh wait, so wait, have you experienced reality in the same way though, where that there is a prior definition, which still exists, obviously. You don't replace definitions necessarily, just like literally also means literally as well as it now means figuratively. And that's a gilded, I know I'm sort of gilding my own lily there in terms of the example I use. So I fully recognize I didn't intend it as such, but subconsciously I probably did. That there was a prior definition and there is a new proposed definition. Like, is that how you've experienced?
Yes. And I know okay. We've talked about that at length, and that's one of the reasons there's a few reasons this has bubbled up, I think, between us and some of your other conversations, and this is in a category of that, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
That the way it's talked about broadly and systemically is a newer concept, I think, in terms of the actual terminology. Yeah. Now lots of people debate sort of the actual nature of it and the systemic nature, especially, and when that came about. And one thing I appreciate about you is that I think one of the reasons you're trying to bring us back to these definitions again and again is because if we dilute the meaning too much, then what the heck are we talking about at the end of the day? Like, what do we like? Words matter, like definitions matter. Yeah. And I think about it, not, I've gone, as we've said at length, very deep into woke culture. And so I'll come at this from a certain perspective of what I learned there. And some of that's history, and some of that's what's happening now, and everything in between. And there's, dare I say, nuance in the definitions. And the challenge I see is that the modifiers really, really matter. So, like even talking about racism, I mean, I've developed workshops around that, and I personally like to distinguish between interpersonal racism, which is, I think, more how you tend to think about it, or how it's more historically been defined, like a racist act, like an overt racist. Yeah,
well, yeah. I would put racism. Racism has to be internal, fundamentally, because it's an ism. You know what I mean? It's a philosophy first and foremost, even before it's an act. So an act can appear to be racist. Like if you went and lynched a black man, right? That would appear to be a racist act, but it is not de facto a racist act. You would have to establish why that particular black man was being lynched, for example, right? Recognizing that I know lynching has a racist connotation, but lynching is also just how people enacted mob justice throughout a lengthy period. And as we know, disproportionately more black people than white people were lynched in the American South, but more white people than black people were lynched in the American South in total, because it was a larger population. So I don't mean, you know what I'm saying? Like in that way.
I think even before we started talking, I thought it was necessary to actually have two terms and say, well, there's interpersonal racism and then there's systemic. The systemic racism, I know, is the part that you challenge more, and that is much harder, I think, to sort of quantify. And some of that is just well, trust us, it's there, the kind of deal, which we certainly don't buy. But
oh gosh, no.
I've spent the last several years super buying into that. So that's just an interesting difference between us, and I'm sure one that will show up here today, because you can't have the idea of white supremacy is, to me, completely inextricably linked with racism in some way. And so anyway, so that's some brief, very brief, too brief definition of what we might mean by white. And I put these together in terms of the actual language, and I put them in the same category, because we've talked quite a bit about racism and how the language has changed. Oh yeah, I know what I wanted to. So I distinguish them because I think something you're often up against is like, well, wait a minute, but when people just say racism, they mean systemic racism. So it's become very difficult to sort of pick apart what the heck people are talking about.
Yeah.
With eight-year-old a lot. I'm not cussing on this show anymore. This is weird.
Hey, look at you. You're changing your mind before our very eyes.
So then to come back to white supremacy, one of the pieces of history that I read about that seems viable is that in 1444, there was a Portuguese prince, Henry the Navigator, and he became the first European to sail to sub-Saharan Africa and seize captives directly, rather than buying slaves and enslaved Africans from North African middlemen. And in that, basically did some content marketing, as we would call it now, where he wrote about, they lived like beasts. They had no understanding of good, but only knew how to live in bestial sloth. So, and then that spread amongst the elites in Portugal, and I think beyond, in like European elites. And so that started to define, but something I think we absolutely both agree on, because it's true, is that that's not when slavery started by any stretch of the imagination. That's not when othering started. That's not when oppression started. That's not when destruction of basically genocide started. But that is one marker of when, for whatever reason, and the way I understand it is because there might have started to be some resistance, or maybe the fact that they were now doing this directly rather than just sort of going to the market and letting somebody else do the dirty work. There became some need to justify why these people were less than, or why they weren't even people at all. And that reason became, because they have dark skin.
Yeah, and it's an interest. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And ergo, that's one historical story about how race was born, particularly to elevate white people, or lightly melanated Southern Europe.
Well, it's interesting because you shared some of that from an article from Open Democracy on this phenomenon, right? And what's interesting in the quotes from it, right? So this guy, this sounds gross to me, although I wasn't there. This is his lived experience, but this is the beautiful thing of denying lived experiences based on like contrary evidence. So Zarora, who was a chief chronicler of the Kingdom of Portugal. How cool is that to have a chief chronicler, by the way? Wrote, portrayed slavery as an improvement over freedom in Africa, which is fascinating. I'm sure the Romans seemed like a kind of culture that would be up to that, but generally this is a new proposition, as far as I'm aware, that I've never seen, where someone's saying that slavery would be better than freedom, as opposed to it's the plight of those who are slaves. You know what I mean? People are born to, many people throughout history have had essentially something similar to a caste system assumption, it seems like, where they're just like, well, what do you mean? You were born to be a slave. You're born to be a serf. You were born a serf. You'll always be a serf. I was born to be royal. I'm meant to be royal. Essentially, like, it is what it is. We are what we are. And we are as such, either by divine appointment or by reincarnative blessing, right? I mean, obviously through any sort of reincarnative lens, if you were born of a higher station, then you absolutely deserved it, because whatever you did, because your karma, whatever you did in your past life, right? So here, though, in the quotes used, right, they lived like beasts, had no understanding of good, but only knew how to live in bestial sloth. Fascinating, because that connects good to productivity. Sort of fascinating. We'll probably talk about capitalism at some point. But nothing in this speaks anything as to skin color. So there's nothing racial. There's nothing racial involved in here at all. They'd already been buying black folks. There was no need to indicate that like black folks were less than or whatever. So it's actually fascinating here, speaking about a culture, not necessarily race. So it's saying it's a cultural improvement over over essentially African culture, certainly in othering, as is not, I don't even know how wildly necessary it is for slavery, just because slavery, I think, was just an assumed reality for most human beings throughout human history. But I think that the interesting thing, and the thing that you said, that you sent, it was sort of suggesting that this then led to racism, where really there's no conversation about race that they quoted. And I would assume, it could be incorrect, that if they wanted to make that connection explicit, if they had explicit language to do so, they would have used it, and they didn't. I could be wrong because I wasn't there in the editorial meeting, but it is fascinating that race is not mentioned at all, nor is it necessary for this justification. It would just be cultural. It's like, oh, y'all are gross. They said the same. I mean, again, being Irish or whatever, English said the same thing about Irish. You know what I mean? They're barbarians or whatever. And so there doesn't. So then it's a culture. It's speaking to a cultural improvement as opposed to a racial one. In which case, race might not have been important at all. But I consider Portuguese brown people. So shows how othering I am.
Yeah, and I think there's more to that, and I guess just in the context of attribution, that particular segment was not only borrowed from the article you've referenced, which
we'll
get out on our Tumblr, but also John Ewan, the podcast How Race Was Made. So there's probably some more texture there around what we would come to think of as race, or the melanation, the darker skin of Africans, and it just seems like a very convenient way to other people. It seems like a very convenient way to say, visually, it's a very obvious visual thing. It's a very easy way to sort people. Boom. In that way, it just seems like, in the context of as the rest. Actually, there's this other paragraph that I didn't mention, or that I didn't put in yet, from Grada Quilomba, a Portuguese writer, artist, that says, we're not past denial yet. Racism has to do with a psychological process that goes from denial to guilt, from guilt to shame, from shame to recognition, and from recognition to reparation. I feel like we're in complete denial. But this other piece here, just to say that race was manufactured by the early ideologies of colonialism to justify the unjustifiable.
Oh, interesting. Well, so they're suggesting it was born somewhere previous then to Portugal, because this doesn't have anything to do with colonization. So they're saying it was born previously. This is what I mean, man. So these are contrary claims.
Yeah.
Because it's not colonialist to take somebody from somewhere. Colonizing is actually to go and take over a place. And that's not what the Portuguese did here, although they certainly did so in southern India. I married a woman who's Indian. Her last name is Portuguese. So they got around. Notable colonial individuals, but not colonized. Race has nothing to do with colonization here. So those are two contrary claims, and we have to figure out which one is correct. And actually, you know what I'm saying? So, but again, since whenever this is just more of an evidence-based thing, right? Where every this is what I do whenever I read anything, right? That I was like, well, if there's no evidence, but then they like in and again, I haven't heard the whole podcast, but if they're trying to make this in an article, you'd put the most explicit information in there to make your connections for you. But since in this article that you sent, for example, it says nothing about race whatsoever, and then it just starts talking about race as though it was there, which is a trick. It's a rhetorical trick. It's almost like a sleight of hand. You're like, oh, you say something that's maybe similar, and then you jump over here, where there's a huge missing link. So then basically it's a like talking about race after talking about culture is that's a leap. That's a logical leap with no link in between. And if you do it confidently enough, I've done it myself, you can often trick people into thinking, because our brains do this, right? If you miss letters in something, if you leave letters out, our brains will fill in usually whatever contextual word makes the most sense. But at least in this sharing and the other quote you shared, those are contrary claims, and there's no connection to race made at all in the thing. So that's fascinating, right? Because then you're just like, oh, okay, you just assume it must be true because they've moved on. They've connected the subjects for you, but they haven't actually connected them. Isn't that fascinating? So now that makes me doubt the claim. You know what I mean? Immediately. But that's just that's where I have a skeptical mind. But we're both writers. And as a writer, like, you wouldn't do that, right? I mean, you write, you wouldn't necessarily leap from something to something else and just be like, well, I'll leave you to connect the dots when there's no actual connection yet.
I think I'm more likely to do that than you, which is
okay.
like something I value about how your tenacity for making sure there's no weak links, because yeah, like I do think I make leaps, or I sort of go down some convenient paths in these
Yeah.
conversations that
Yeah.
has made everything even more complex. So
things are complex. Yeah. Yeah. And listen, I get it. In terms of rhetoric, you do try to simplify. And often in my writing, I've been accused of being overly complex because I use a ton of parenthetical references because I'm like, I write as though I'm reading it. You know what I mean? But
yeah,
I just think this is
you
just
want the
something
entire like mind map in your writing.
yeah, I just see this a lot. And this is, I send articles to you almost maybe too much, that do this sort of thing where I'm like, wait a second. And so this one did this as well, where it's just like ideas of white supremacy and development came in handy when colonizing nations were looking for ideologies that would justify this kind of ruthless subjugation. It wasn't ruthless subjugation. It was de rigueur economic activity at the time. So this is reading history through a present day lens. That's inaccurate. And then there's nothing to do. They literally showed no evidence of white supremacy whatsoever. Like there's nothing here to do. So they've provided no evidence of it. And they're like, see, so that's how, so that's why I think in general, the new definition of white supremacy, I genuinely reject, A, because it's self-contradictory, and then B, no, I've never seen a good argument for it. And I've seen a lot of, just like this one, really poor arguments. So this is a bad argument, for example. You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense? So, oh wait, let me just go back real quick.
It goes on.
Go.
It goes on to explain what's happening with you right now, because confronting white people with the historical system of white superiority and with their own internalized racism can be extremely challenging, triggering numerous evasion and defensive mechanisms.
Yeah, isn't that fun? Basically, if you disagree with me, it proves my theory. It's a hilarious. It's the funny thing. And so, for example, that's another thing I've heard a bunch of times. It is, well, it's funny. I think it's as silly as a monkey in a banana suit doing roller derby. Like, it's just hilarious, right? You ever seen that Any Which Way But Loose, the Clint Eastwood thing? He's not funny, but it's him and an orangutan is like, he's his co-star. It's like Turner and Hooch. And it's funny. I don't know why. It's just immediately funny. And Clint Eastwood is not funny. He is not a comedic actor.
Was that the right turn, Clyde?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think so.
I didn't even remember the name of it, but I remember that right turn, Clyde.
Yeah. So so the fact that people would make such a proposal that it's like, oh, when you disagree with me, it's proof that I'm right. I mean, that's just one of the silliest things. That's just nobody. I mean, people will fall for that, but only the most highly suggestible person would ever fall for that, because all you have to do is return it and go, well, no, my proposal is true, and the fact that you are evading it is proof that I'm right. So, for example, it would lead to a never-ending no you, no you, no you, no you. It's infantile. It's childish, and I think it's a childish invention invented by smart people, because I think really smart people are able to condense things wisely. I would just want to look at the initial definition of white supremacy, like what I still assume, because I'm a semantic conservative. Okay. White supremacy, but this is Wikipedia, right? So this is like a crummy, thrown together cultural understanding. Basically, it's like the People's Britannica, right? It has a left bias or whatever. We know all that, but I think it's mild, honestly, on a lot of entries, personally. But white supremacy is the belief that white people are superior to those of other races and thus should dominate them. That last phrase, by the way, I would not have assumed, because to me, it's essentially has to be ideological. But thus should dominate them is fascinating. The CRT definition speaks more of this.
Meaning that you're distinguishing the ideology of I'm superior to you to the action of domination. Is that what you mean?
Or even the intention towards domination, because you
might be able to live. It might be possible to just walk around and believe I'm superior without actually wanting.
Well, yeah, because if you do too much active stuff to dominate other people, you're disproving your own theory.
Right.
Like if you invent.
If I have to dominate you,
then you're not.
I'm not inherently superior.
Yeah. So this is the whole problem with it's contrary. The previous definition, just like literally and figuratively, is contrary to the new definition, because the new definition says that there's like a bunch of laws in place to make sure white supremacy happens, but that denies supremacy. Because if you have to do a bunch of things to like shore up your supremacy, you're not supreme. So then then you're basically saying that's a false impression. You know what I mean? It's such a tangled thing that basically contradicts the previous one. So Oxford said it's the belief that white people are better than other groups and should have power over them. So I have to, whether or not that's what I thought, I do have to, I sort of feel like I have to submit to the fact that that's the preeminent definition. That power, that they should have power by virtue of their supremacy. And I just, in terms of lived experience, I grew up in a culture where Black supremacy was far more popular than white supremacy. So the fact that people are talking about white supremacy, I think, is really wild in terms of the actual original definition. The only people I ever heard say things like this were people who were culturally conceived of as detestable. Nazis, neo-Nazis, whatever, the KKK, you know what I mean? Those sort of people were the only people I'd ever heard say such a thing. I've heard people espouse Black supremacist beliefs my entire life. I still hear it on a weekly basis. We have a ton of Black Israelites here in Raleigh. So I literally hear people screaming it out on street corners on a weekly basis in public with little to no harassment. And I've heard it my entire life in pop culture, in music. It was the general assumption of especially young men growing up that basically everybody wanted to be a Black man. And I know Black people would be like, you don't really want to be us, y'all. Go ahead and check that. But you don't, then therefore you're claiming to know the truth of someone's internal reckoning about what they wanted and didn't want, which is fascinating. That's a fascinating, now I'm into that, you know what I mean? I'm into challenging lived experiences and personal declarations of truth. But so it's fascinating to me that like there seems to be like a renewed obsession with the term, but I think the renewed obsession with the term is actually rooted mostly in the new term, although people still profess that like white supremacist groups are the like #1 terrorist group in the United States and stuff. So people still talk about it in the old way too, while also trying to talk about it in the new way. But those, I don't know, maybe it doesn't seem contradictory to you, but those definitions do conflict in terms, so they can't coexist as coordinate definitions completely because they parts of each other, they cancel each other out.
So as we move through this, so we've talked about white, we've sort of touched on supremacy, although I want to come back to that.
Yeah.
Now talked about white supremacy, and then you mentioned something I think that's very important is also to talk about the white supremacist.
Mm-hmm.
And that I feel like is an important part of particularly what is, I think, true historically. And you just mentioned the KKK and the Nazis and groups that are unabashedly white supremacist. And you know, for some reason, I'm in Chicago. The Blues Brothers comes to mind as a
all right. They break into a meeting or whatever.
Comical view of Illinois Nazis.
Yes. They're figures of mockery. White supremacists, that means people who adhere to this belief, right? White supremacy is like Christianity, right? And then a Christian is someone who lives by those beliefs. So white supremacist is anybody who lives by the belief of white supremacy. And Blues Brothers, I don't know when Blues Brothers came out. I feel like it came out before I was born, but I could be wrong. I certainly wasn't allowed to see it as a child. But that's how long, our entire generation, white supremacy has only been a mocked, only been a mocked or derided or seen as evil ideology in terms of popular culture or even my own interactions. I think I've only heard 2 people even speak white supremacist ideology in my presence in my entire life. And I've heard thousands, just as a contrast, like as a white or Black thing, thousands of Black supremacist examples that I could quote to you, songs I could share, especially in hip hop. I was a big hip hop head growing up, and the 5 Percenters and the Nation of Islam are both Black supremacist organizations, definitively that were very influential in culture, in pop culture, in terms of music or whatever.
Well, I feel like a lot of the justification for that is the idea that that's defending against, it's a defensive posture.
Sure.
Because of the prevalence of white supremacy.
It might be. I mean, their claim is that it's rooted in history.
Right.
Literally,
which would lead us to the last definition to distinguish, which let's call white supremacy culture. And that to me is like the equivalence of racism versus like systemic racism. That idea that it's just the water we swim in, right? Expanded out just literally to everything. One thing I want to very brief loop back. I literally have this taped on my wall because I think I like this from Dr. Rupa Maria, and again, hopefully we can share this. It's this. I don't know if we've ever talked about this, or I feel like we have, but she starts. It's this diagram, and it's like colonialism at the top, and so we could almost like scratch that off in the context of this conversation, because I know we can pick apart colonialism. Context of like what you just said about, are we going somewhere to colonize, are we taking people, whatever. But the next part, and then that breaks down to supremacism and capitalism, and every one of these I'm sure we could do like an entire episode on. But what I generally like about her piece here is that it all rolls up basically to supremacism as a human concept, whereas a lot of the arguments I think that are made that's kind of put white supremacy at the top. Like white supremacy is the thing that's always existed, that's the worst evil. And what I do think you and I agree on is that, well, white supremacy is a version. It certainly exists, at least in the context of what we just said, where there are certainly groups who do that. And so that's the yes part, I'm sure, of both of our answers to today's question.
Yes.
But it still rolls up to a much more general concept of supremacy, which is human nature. Really, I mean history bears that out time and time again. So we could pick this whole chart apart, but she, says, look at white supremacy, male supremacy, human supremacy, but she also goes on to talk about ecocide, right? Like human supremacy, right, is something we almost never talk about in these waters, and that's like, why do we think we can go around and destroy the earth and kill all the animals? And like there's an assumption there about our supremacy, right?
Which I agree with. I am a human supremacist. And I think we are to have dominion over the earth, which makes us responsible for it, which all supremacy does, which is a fascinating part of it, right? Because even white supremacy is not, that's like in terms of living in a I think a formerly patriarchal culture. I think we're loosely such now. I think we're struggling to get away from it, but I don't think it's possible really to get away from it, because I think it's built into the human structure. But we may modify the human structure enough to where it'll be subsumed. Supremacy brings responsibility, because supremacy says, I know best. I think most people believe this. I think most people are supremacists. I know some people who are like, I think in some ways, well, it's interesting. People are not supremacists, but they're supremacists in their assumption that they are not supremacists even. Meaning we all think that we are the best ultimate adjudicators of how we should live our life, which is it's a human supremacist thought, and it's an individualist supremacist thought. So then the problem is, this is my whole thing too, why I think racelessness is a key to dissolving racism. It's the fact that we then start to think of ourselves as part of some sort of group that we're most often really not even part of, that then leads to supremacy becoming not even, well, actually both beneficial and harmful is the problem, right? Because once you start thinking of yourself a coordinate group, then you can all work together, which is great. But then who's outside of that group? And how do you regard them? That is tough. And that's hard. I think that's a hard thing to navigate. I think we've both experienced just by being human beings. That's hard to navigate, how you don't go, ugh, because we're going this way, which is not that way. And there's a lot of those kind of people going that other way. And then next thing you know, you're saying they a lot, or those people, or then you just start saying extremist or alt blah, 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 or anti blah, blah, blah. And then you're like, oh no.
Well, that's the where does it end question is one that's alive. It may be refreshing for you to hear, even in some DEI circles. There's one practitioner in particular I really respect, who was saying, she's like, we've stricken race as something to talk about in these workshops, because we just thought, I think some form of what you just said, just like, well, where does it end? We're just, to what extent does recognizing this, whether it's historical or current or whatever thing that we can point to in some various ways, to what extent is that useful to address? Because if we can't see something, we can't talk about
acknowledge reality, man.
But then when does it end? When do we get to the point of moving beyond it?
You'd hopefully want to. That's the question, is do people want to? I think a lot of people don't, because I think a lot of people don't want to give up their group identity. And this is actually one of the things I think is interesting in white supremacy. I think actually, let's go ahead. I'm gonna say a white supremacist thing, which I've probably never said in my life. I actually think something that white that white culture, quote unquote, is superior at, because I think various cultures have things that they are statistically more likely to be good at, is racelessness, is group identity. Now, I was raised in a place where like whiteness as a group identity pretty much doesn't really exist. And people are like, oh, you can do that because you're in a safe, a place of safety or plenty or whatever. Everyone in this country really is in a relative place of safety and plenty. So slow your roll, imaginary person. But I actually think it's a good thing. And if it's led to any degree of success, then that's worthy of emulation. This is an interesting thing about supremacist movements is I have a tendency to just dismiss them altogether. Instead of going, well, is there anything that's true about it? Are they 100% wrong? Is there anything that like white, because I've grown up in a culture where like white was bad, essentially. White was good was something that like Black people believed. It's not anything that white people believe. So then, or any white people I've ever met. So, but is there anything good? You know, we've seen, I don't know if you saw that video where it was people were all standing in a row in this room, and then it's some sort of sociological experiment, and they had like all Black folks stay in the room in the middle. And they were like, when on the count of 3, you're going to step over, if you're how proud you are to be what you are, you're going to step over to the right side if you're proud. And then over here is like not proud at all. And then there's like rows in between. And they had the group of Black folks do it. And then all the Black folks just like said 1, 2, 3, and they all went to the wall, completely proud, fully proud of who I am. They did it for white folks. Some people stayed in the middle. Most people moved over to not proud.
I have seen this, yeah.
Nobody went to the proud side. And I was like, that is straight up. It's just not relevant. And I think it's one of the strengths of the concept, where it's saying like, there's nothing explicitly superior in some sort of grand sense. Why would you be proud of like, well, I was born this way. I'm so proud of it. Like, well, that's a maybe it's about the semantics of pride or whatever. But I mean, I think that's one cool thing we've learned from having, I think in many ways, we have a nation founded by, not entirely, but I would say quite a heavy influence from white supremacy thinkers, because of the prevalence, I think at the time, of race science indicating for 300 years, race science. Darwin was a fan, for example. I have some good Darwin quotes that are very similar to this Portuguese king, funnily enough. So I think people had that assumption that the races of humankind really were organized in some sort of hierarchy of evolutionary development, meaning that, and this is just logical, right? That if we all developed, like you were talking about, from dark people, the lightest people would be the newest version, right? They would be the most evolved version if that's essentially how it functioned. And we have the tendency, and this is not accurate, that the newest is always best, right? And so it's basically like, well, what do you mean? The iPhone 15 is better than the iPhone 11, right? And that's what you want. You want the newest one. And so
when did the iPhone 15 come out?
No, I just don't. I don't even know what number the iPhone is on now. But like, and then even this is again what Darwin said in The Descent of Man. He said the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. Will be widened through extinction of the great apes once we kill off the great apes, leaving a gap between the more civilized man and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. So once we kill the apes, that'll kind of like help. That'll actually, widen the gap between like light white people and dark people or whatever. So that pervaded, obviously that's very much around the founding of our nation in that same sort of century or so. So I think that, again, so if people say that was white supremacy involved in the founding of this nation is another way in which white supremacy is real. Yes. But what can we learn from that,
Well, and I think I'm channeling the podcast Seen on Radio, where they did, I don't know if they name all of their seasons, but one season was named Seeing White.
Yeah.
And unless I'm just mixing things up, because I've looked at a lot of different resources, but
yeah,
there was a version of that also, sort of refreshingly talked about how, the othering and the supremacy existed from England to the other islands, which you're, I think, really familiar with. And that obviously had nothing, their skin color was really quite similar.
No,
so
it's similar to the Portuguese thing. It's a cultural thing.
Yeah.
Because Irish are drunken louts, barely barbarians.
And one of the, I'm just remembering one of the things about that was they wore all white. Like their clothing was all white. And so there was sort of some people were looking at that piece of history and being like, well, that's okay. So that's looking at white, which I'm really sensitive to that language. I mean, there's even like consciousness work, we talk about the shadow. So there's this sense of like, light is good and the shadow is bad. And deeper shadow work, you know, would say that shadow is not bad, but it's just something we need to look at, and it's part of us and love. But there is a sense in so many different places, and you know, some of that, like, I don't know, lots of kids are afraid of the dark. We're afraid of the unknown. When we can't see things very well, they tend to sometimes have more fear. So they,
and if you have white clothing that you can keep white, you are a special kind of being. Every time I wear white jeans, it's
like before they invented bleach.
Within 15 minutes. So you're like, it's an impossibility in a filthy world, right? Whereas if you have dark clothing's great. You wear black clothes, it doesn't kind of matter what you spill on it. So it is just a practicum. But now, of course, the fact that we metaphorize that to skin color is such a leap. It's one of those things. There's a huge disconnect there as to then, okay, why that would relate to, well, dark skin color then is more like the filthiness. You're like, what? Sure, I guess in visual proximity of color, but that doesn't mean like you're more likely to be infected, has more bacterium on it, it's more dangerous in any way. You know what I mean? Like a black car, whatever, black car versus a white car or whatever. But it's just, you know, it reflects light. That's it. That's all we're talking about.
Well, and I'm remembering too, and this was probably especially at a period where I was sort of lazily correlating things, but I remember I was traveling to Vietnam, and we flew back through Thailand, and just seeing this huge billboard for like skin whitening. I think it was pearl white or something. I don't know, but it was just like, so there is certainly, whether it's pure marketing or culturally, or, you know, that's probably a whole part too. So, and I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll just sort of plant the seed for that. Like, how does it show up that we celebrate and sell the idea of being more white as something good?
Did white folks do that, or is that a Vietnamese invention? Like,
exactly, like it stuck out because I was in Thailand. I was like, oh God, what does that mean?
It's fascinating. I saw ads for it. I don't know if I think it's sort of, it's becoming less fashionable or whatever, but there was ads for that when we were in India on the TV constantly for like skin so fair or whatever. And I was like, is that just one? Now, does that come from like British people being like, we're better than you because of our fairness? Or is that an Indian invention being like wanting to be like something else? Like likewise with Black culture, octoroon balls or whatever in our own history. Is that wanting to look like someone who you recognize as more powerful than you? Or we see it with skin darkening or tanning beds or whatever. It's pretty much just about emulating, in which case you can't blame someone else for you wanting to be like them. You can blame people who then specifically were like, you must be more like this. That would be supremacist, right? But I see you see colorism in the Black community still to this day.
My gosh,
more popular in the 80s or whatever, but so then that's a fascinating thing. But then you're like, you can't blame anyone else for that unless someone specifically told, like a white person introduced that concept to you, because then that means actually you have a white supremacy problem. That's like that would be that would be like literally you're into white supremacy, you're white supremacy, like that literally functionally makes a Black person a white supremacist because they believe being lighter is somehow superior. So that's, I mean, that's a human problem because we all have to fix everybody's problems together, but that's not coming necessarily from white people.
Well, and this is where we start getting into the embodied work of, say, Resmaa Menakem and others, who that really gets us into that systemic, I think, much more difficult to sort of prove or point at piece, where it's like, no, after so many generations, people were so downtrodden and destroyed and torn apart that they just sort of stopped believing in their own sovereignty. Which would be
good, could be good, right? Because it would be a defeat of supremacist thought. That's fascinating to think about, because supremacist thought is based in the perception of someone's individual sovereignty and the correctness of their own ability to appraise the way to go. That's the foundation of supremacy. I don't think we can become supremacist-less, personally. I can think we can become raceless because I don't think it's really that consequential. But I think
Oh yeah, well,
since supremacy thought is fundamental to our existence.
If I catch your drift, I mean, something I hear fairly often is from, let's say, Black people, to simplify it, but it's like, hey, we don't want to get back at you for slavery and all this. We just want to live our lives. And so that, I think, might correlate to what you just said, is like, well, wouldn't that be rather extraordinary if, as horrible as it was, if it somehow like stripped an entire generation of supremacist thought of any kind, which I'm with you. This is an area we agree on, that supremacy is inherently human. We are animals. We have fear circuitry. That fear circuitry gets triggered, especially if like our bodies or our families are in danger. We're going to get real supremacists real quick.
Oh, for sure.
I've seen it I'm not going to go at length because I already talked about this, but like in revolutionary groups, so-called, that I've seen concentrations of power. I've, seen them engage in othering, and especially in the name of horizontality. And this is something I've studied quite extensively in terms of how do we actually create truly collaborative systems? How do we build systems that sort of acknowledge this human reality and of our biology?
Yeah.
We can't, it's not good enough to just show up and be like, oh, we're horizontal. There's so many organizations over time. I mean, even unions, I'm not anti-union, but my God, I mean, anytime there's a concentration of that much power, certainly unions have done things that aren't great over time as well.
No, it's a mixed bag, as every human construct is. Yeah.
But all of this, I think, may lead us to one thing that was pretty popular a few years ago, called the characteristics of white supremacy culture, which I don't realize until right before this, that there's literally a domain, a website called whitesupremacyculture.info.
I know, it's got all the stuff.
So, and then you click on the characteristics tab. But yeah, it's quite extensive. It's actually quite beautiful. So to skip to you can read through all this, but to sort of cut to the chase, there's a few characteristics that I'll just name these. So fear, one right way, either or and the binary, denial and defensiveness, right to comfort and fear of conflict, individualism, progress is more and quantity over quality, worship of written word, and urgency. And the very broad idea here, and I believe there's some truth to this, but that this is all in contrast to indigenous cultures. And there's some truth to that, but there's some pretty big problems with that in the context of like, well, which indigenous cultures? Like, there's a lot of them, and B,
and white people are indigenous.
Well, that's true, and that's part of my own journey. Actually, I realized at some point, maybe the most important thing for me to do is actually understand what I'm mostly English. Like, what were indigenous English people like? What was going on? Like, what was their spirituality? All that.
What's our what was their journey?
But the other challenge with that is that it does tend to romanticize indigenous cultures, as though none of these characteristics ever existed before the idea of white supremacy.
Oh my gosh,
Or maybe the most generous explanation is that, white supremacy is sort of perfecting these, which there's like an argument for that. Like, I don't know, at least the story I heard is Hitler came over here to study how we were doing racism because we'd done it, we did it so well in America. Anyway, what is your perspective on the characteristics of white supremacy culture?
It would be fascinating. It's, I guess the presupposition, I think, is hogwash, meaning it's the culture, is the way of life of a group of people. That's true. I agree with that. White supremacy culture, meaning this is how white supremacists think. I have to tell you, having spoken to people who I think would vehemently oppose white supremacy, defensiveness is one of the traits. I've not found more defensive people than people who try to defend systemic racism. Oh, in terms of online, this is where my online thing. Right to
as a good thing, but defend the idea of systemic racism. You mean?
Yeah, yeah, right. And then personal defense, they become personally defensive. I think you had just sent me the first page of a thing, which was like one of the most offensively defensive things on sort of on like brown people teaching white people about whiteness or whatever, and being quite defensive and irritated about it. So the fascinating thing is to look at all of these. There's some good characteristics here and there's some bad ones. And then there is erasing individualism, which would mean, I assume then it's fascinating that individualism is a fundamental cultural element of people who are fundamentally collectivist, because a white supremacist has to be fundamentally collectivist. So some of these things just don't make that doesn't make any logical sense, right? If you value that which you do not base your existence on. So then basically you're saying they're liars in the way that they pretend to prioritize, in which case these aren't really characteristics, these are false I mean, right? Your brain starts to and it also presumes. So I think the problem is, and I think this is where a lot of people's defensiveness came from. I don't know any white supremacists really. This guy Blaine is probably the only person I've ever met in my life who was a white supremacist. So then I don't know how he felt about all those things. And I don't know any people to go talk to and consult about this. We'd have to go speak to white supremacists to see if this validates their culture. I think a lot of people got too mad about this sort of thing because people started teaching this as though it was related to whiteness, which it isn't. That's not even the claim. And then some people were like, this is white, but some people have made that claim. I shouldn't say no one has, where they're like, oh, these are the attributes, these are cultural attributes of whiteness, essentially. But that's not what's being claimed here.
Well, I think it is, and I think this is where the language gets all tripped up, because as this is presented and as I've read it, I have always associated this with that systemic culture, and people absolutely often relate this to capitalism, point at where these characteristics show up in the business world.
Yeah.
I've never heard anybody correlate this to the idea of a white supremacist. Like, oh,
yeah, so then
the neo-Nazi has these characteristics. No, they're like the guy in the suit, downtown. He's the one.
Well, he has to either, but in order to, see, this is what I mean. The definitions are contrary. So then the latter definition, just because the arguments suck, I'm assuming doesn't exist. Just because the arguments are terrible, no one has any good arguments for it. So I'm not going to be, the prevalence of bad arguments is often, for me, highly convincing of the contrary. So if all I hear is bad arguments, then I'm going to assume that there is no defense. Because especially when those bad arguments get popular or whatever, then I'm like, all right. So yeah, so then this, for example, doesn't really exist. If white supremacist culture has no assumption in any way as to white supremacy, then it can't be a white supremacist culture. Or you're just inventing a new thing completely. So then it's not that. You need to call it something else and not be lazy or whatever. But then if you're saying that about the United States, then that means if the United States is a systemically white supremacist culture, then this is the culture of everybody in the United States, essentially, right? So that's
the argument. Like, this is the water. Like, this is the norm. This is
the norm. This is the thing. So then,
which is also interesting, because
Black supremacists,
one contradiction you often also see is that that white people and whiteness have no culture. So even calling it white supremacy culture is kind of like, or maybe that's the criticism, is like, oh, this is the closest thing we have to culture, which is all based on domination and oppression and colonialism.
Yeah, which is that's as silly as a monkey in a banana suit playing roller derby. That's not even a serious proposition. Because again, black supremacists believe most of these things. Progress is bigger and more, absolutely. Perfectionism, absolutely. Right to comfort, absolutely. Sense of urgency, absolutely. Defensiveness, absolutely. Individualism, absolutely. Quality over quantity. Quantity over quality. That's I don't know. Quality, quantity would be the best. Either or thinking, absolutely. Worship of the written word, absolutely. Objectivity. That is hilarious. If you try to paint, this is when I start to see manipulation. When you put objectivity as like somehow a malevolent supreme ruling, what you're essentially engaging in is attempted tyranny. Because if you remove like objectivity as like should be a dominant, then the opposite would be subjectivity. So then if subjectivity rules, then then whoever's most powerful wins, always. If you remove the idea of being able to like validate anything through objective means, or the dominance of, then that is exactly what tyrants have done throughout human history. They basically say, the king says, oh, well, I think it's this. No, the king's foot determines what a foot is. Change everything, carpenters. Good luck engineering. You can't accomplish anything. So especially when I see stuff like that, I'm like, oh, this is just, it's mostly manipulation. Do those things exist in our culture? Yes. Are all of them good? No. Does it have anything to do with white supremacy? Heck if I know. No one's made that connection that I've seen. But I've seen people not make that connection to pretend they made the connection. So I just don't know. And I don't know why they call it white supremacy. That's just, it's baffling. And anytime you talk to anybody, they're like, go get educated. And you're like, oh, okay, thanks. Thanks for helping me.
There's a whole website, Brendan.
I know, but even in reading it, and again, I was like, to me, it just basically seems like a way to communicate power, like everything's about power, right? It's that sort of idea. It's this, whatever, the accusation of cultural Marxism becomes prevalent because it includes capitalism, as though capitalism is as oppressive as sexism, but it doesn't say communism, right? Which would be, if you're going to put systems of economic social organization, you'd put like maybe at least the top two one. The fact that they only put capitalism basically seems like they're trying to do a pseudo-Marxist way of, instead of talking about class, they're trying to make it about race. That's like the general accusation against this sort of premise in general. And I was like, I mean, I'm not completely convinced by that argument, but it's a tenable argument, especially when you explicitly put capitalism in there, but you don't put communism, despite the fact that communism is ideologically is responsible for the most monumental genocides we've had recorded in human history. So you're like, oh, we know how malevolent that can get. I think capitalist societies, something like 12 million, we killed like 12 million indigenous people here. Like as a saying us, meaning like, people, citizens of the United States of America, all races, we're all to blame because it was our government did it. I have a passport that says United States of America. So to some degree, I'm stuck with that identity on paper, like objectively. So we killed a ton of people. Capitalists have killed a ton of people. We've lost. We're not as proficient in like committing genocide. So when I see that, to me, the whole thing reads disingenuous, but I think you're a more positive person than I am. So I have a tendency when people start being disingenuous or making shitty arguments, then I have the tendency to just like go, all right, fine. I'll argue with you as long as I can. And I certainly interact with these people who believe these things on a regular basis to intense debate degrees. But I think you have a better handle on, okay, but what about this is true, right? And this is one of the tendencies I rely on my wife for you for, people in my life to be like, okay, yes, great. That's all the things that are completely wrong with this. You're not wrong, but what's right about this? You know what I mean? And so that's why I would look to you to help me. Like, how do we show that this is white supremacist, Stephen, for example?
Well, and I thank you for that. And I also have a tendency to really go all in and skip a few steps, which is, we've talked at length about more like the woke religion. So I have to admit, when I first saw this, it was at a period where I was just like, yep, absolutely. That's the water we're in. It's all white supremacy culture. That's, and even justifying if somebody who's not white engages in this, it must be, there's no other conclusion than it must be due to the subjugation and the oppression and the fact that the only way they could re-engage with and survive in a white supremacy society was actually to bring on and take on those characteristics as well.
Yeah.
There's probably some of that happening, but
I would say, probably, right?
But I feel like in some way I'm like in this reform period where I'm kind of like, okay, well, what happens if I don't go all in to the ideology and just accept all of it as true? And so one thing we might both agree on is that we could take any one of these characteristics and we could have a whole discussion about trying to objectively connect that to white supremacy in a variety of ways. That'd be interesting. Or we could, not to bypass it, but to say, and this is, I also have a lot of training as a coach and leadership development. Any one of these, you could just look at in the context of, I think, as you just mentioned, some of these are qualities that I think we would both agree on aren't the best way to behave, aren't going to lead to the best outcomes for myself and whatever community.
Yeah,
with.
like pragmatic, yeah.
And that could be valuable, right? So
yes.
The question maybe coming out is like, how valuable is it to just blanket call all of these traits white supremacy culture, which is I would even at this point say that's too broad a brush. It's an interesting perspective, and I personally I believe in the correlation of that, I think, more than you do. And I question, like, why is that valuable, along with just looking at each of these qualities and ways of being and saying, where does this show up in your life? And if the culture that's really diverse, maybe you could have a really honest discussion and be like, wow, gosh, the white people actually do this stuff more. That's interesting. What does that mean?
Yeah. It'd be fascinating, right? Yeah. Well, I think that's what it's good to. That's why I appreciate, even in this breakdown, the focus on culture. It's like, I think culture is massively influential, and because of, in part, like racial histories, racist histories, and even racial classification histories, not even racist, but just racial also. People have a tendency to like cleave to groups and then form a culture within that group. And not all of anybody's culture is perfect. Some of it sucks, some of it's awesome, right? That's just how we do things, is not any justification for good or evil. You know what I mean? It's good to celebrate the good and castigate the evil. I guess my question is, I'm fascinated just in terms of, as I've been observing this sense of like, okay, if I devalue objectivity and upvalue subjectivity, if I've never heard, like, if white supremacy is the water we swim in, why is it only dominantly subconscious? Like, why does nobody say, they're like, oh, they're dog whistling about it now, see? And you're like, maybe. Why does no one say it out loud ever? Or even when they do, like, why does our entire culture castigate it as a concept? Hate, like, again, I don't know anybody, and I've rarely ever met anyone who thinks white supremacist thought is right or good or in any way should be elevated in my entire life. So my lived experience says people hate white supremacy. Everyone does, quote unquote, everyone. And then nobody says it out loud ever. So it seems like if it was the water, it would come up, like, it would come up more often. People would say it. It would just kind of slip out, more often. And it like almost never does. So that to me just makes me go, like, it's weird to say that it's the water. It's ocean big, because people talk about the ocean all the time, and I see the ocean all the time. So if I can't see it, my lived experience says this is complete hogwash. So then subjectively, this whole thing's a lie, right? But I live in an objective world, so I'm like, let's look at the evidence. There's evidence of it. Just because I don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? All that sort of thing. This is the inferiority of subjectivity on display. But I was like, wow, I think that's, I don't know, I've never even thought about that question until this conversation. I was like, why do we only talk about how we hate it and no one says it?
I mean, that's the tone of this kind of training, is that we don't say it because it's subconscious and we don't see it.
Yeah, but we consciously talk about it in hateful ways often, like a lot.
Right.
So then it's not a subconscious concept. Like,
but we skip from the subconscious reality of living it to the guilt of becoming aware of it. Yeah, I think we skip over the part of saying, like, oh, being white is great, if that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, or well, not even just great, like literally it has to be superior, right? Supremacy necessitates that as a belief or even a reality, because white people we don't live in a white supremacist culture where white people are the most successful group. They're not. So that's an objective fact. Like, literally,
what if we zoom into like early 20th century, where
maybe then, yeah, but
Jim Crow, where it's kind of like more overtly in the water in the context of like segregation, where hey, you're supposed to be in that bathroom, you're supposed to be in that water fountain, you're supposed to be in that part of the bus, because that's like that's objective, right? That's like somebody saying where you should be.
Mostly. Well, right. Unless they were being honest, which I don't think they were, about the separate but equal concept, in which case that's not supremacist. It's just separate. So that's not even explicitly de facto supremacist. I think they're lying personally, but I don't know. I don't live inside their head, but I think there's an objective evidence. You have to look at objectively, right? I think there's objective evidence that I think it was. There's plenty of white supremacy pervading.
Is it better to be on the front of the bus or the back of the bus?
I like the back of the bus personally.
See, that's very telling, because you were like, hey, Black people on the back of the bus, that's the best part of the bus.
That's the best part, because that is that big long seat where you can sit next to everybody or whatever. I don't care, wherever there's a seat, really. That's when it becomes a problem. And this is right. Scarcity creates the tension. When there's not too many seats, or there's only seats in the front, you're like, well, the seat is where I sit, right? But separate is not necessarily separate. It just could be based on false belief, right? Because we just did this during the pandemic and didn't really seem to be too concerned about it. That there was, if you're not wearing a mask, you stay outside. If you're not vaccinated, you don't come in here. We talked about it extensively. It's based on fear. Now, was there supremacist thought in that? The vaccinated people thought they were supreme? Some people, but was that the entire culture creating it? Not de facto. So you can't de facto assume that about segregation concepts either, right? Now, I think they were, and I would argue that they were, but we can't say that they were definitively as for any person who set those things in place. You know what I'm saying? So since it is complex, that's what I mean. Like,
but it reliably showed up in like redlining and
early, or at least early, explicitly in early redlining, But then did it descend into class, or was it already coordinate with class? In which case it's class redlining at this point. Like, we don't know if it's still racial anymore, or if it's class or political based. And so some of the white supremacy culture, that may have been true in 1950. I wasn't born in 1950. The world I've grown up in, to say it's the water we live in, I was like, we'd see manifestations of it. You'd see, people would say it. Someone would be saying it. If it was the water we swim in, people would feel a lot more comfortable with saying. And again, maybe people have had lived experience where they've heard plenty of people say such things. I've only heard white supremacist thing come from Black people. You know what I mean, in terms of colorist stuff or whatever. Oh gosh, yeah, my mom wouldn't let me go out in the sun because I was like, okay, that's weird.
Well, here's a story.
So my fascination is that I think this is in the misapprehension of associating white supremacy culture with whiteness. White supremacy culture could just as tenably, through my lived experience only, it's a Black concept. So I would associate white supremacy with Blackness, just my lived experience alone, and that's a tenable proposal. I don't know if that's any more dynamic or true than the prior proposal, but it's at least it's as tenable, and I've seen and heard actual manifestations of it. So then that's the thing. I was like, well, why does it manifest there out loud, but it doesn't manifest? I don't see it manifest amongst people who would be in a supremacist culture.
So it's, microaggressions, I think, are a whole category here, which even there's some controversy, or, some people are like, we shouldn't talk about them because they're not micro. They're actually have a huge impact, right? Or people just think of the whole idea of that kind of language as a distraction. But I heard a story 2 days ago. I co-produce a dialogue with Van Gilmer called Intimate Dialogues about race, and it's, he was telling a story this week about just how he is regularly treated, particularly by white folks. He's lives in a very white community in the north suburbs of Chicago, works for the Baha'i Temple. It's just, he's in a very white world. He's 80 years old. He was sitting in the lunch counters in the 50s, and I want to be careful not to reveal like too much of his story, but
sure,
the high level version was just that he's regularly interacting with white folks who like would say something perhaps like, I hear what you're saying, but basically constantly challenge him in his experience, particularly when talking about race and racism in his experience.
Yeah.
And then he interprets that. I think it would, I don't know if he would name it as white supremacy, interestingly enough, but I certainly think he would name it as racism and a problem and a challenge with race in America, as he has lived a kind of experience and stories I'll never fully understand.
Right. Which is his perspective is a self-supremacist perspective. That to be challenged, for someone to be challenged in their claim is like causes a consternation and umbrage. So it's a supremacist thought that his perception is supreme and should not be challenged or questioned. Which I think old people do a lot. That's right. I'm an ageist. And I've thought this since I was a child. I was like, old people think they know everything. A lot of old people, 80-year-olds are just 80 times worse. Some of them are 80 times more awesome. Or 40, you have good and bad years. So that's fascinating to me. Like, again, if that's what you're in, but if we're going to go on lived experience only, then so is that true? Is his perception true? Or because I've had an opposite experience, is my perception true? And then how do you weigh, this is the whole problem, right? And then how do you put lived experience next to each other? And this is where I think the intersectional thing comes in and is malevolent, where it says, well, we elevate the voices of the marginalized, meaning they are the saintly or priestly class. So then if you're lower in the marginalization scale, your voice counts for more. And then starting to assign anybody your voice counts for more based on a racial basis is exactly what got us into this mess in the first place, because we are in a mess, right? These things existed. White supremacy existed. White supremacy does exist presently. And it's influenced the founding of our nation, I think, palpably, definitively, objectively. The evidence is there. You can't deny that it wasn't a factor. Was it the dominant factor? I don't think so. Was it heavily influential and absolutely there? Yes. So that's fascinating, right? It creates quite a conundrum just for every human being as to like, how do we navigate such a thing?
Well, and this is not about Van anymore, but I've heard from other Black folks in particular, some that are involved with like DEI, that they might say like, all I care about is systemic racism.
Yeah.
And there's a tender defensiveness there of like, I got thick skin. Like I'm not worried about your hurting my feelings, but what I care about is intergenerational wealth disparity. I'm like, great. Like, so do I. That's the thing that is important to look at and to change, and hopefully you would align with it. That's more measurable. Like that we can actually look at that, right?
We can't necessarily connect it to racism, but you can
certainly correlate it to class, as you said earlier, and all of that. But
it just exists. Yeah, it does exist, and it would be great to make it better.
I also don't fully believe that. I think we are humans. We have feelings.
Yes.
Often see feelings influencing the discussions about race.
Yeah.
I just feel like it'd be more honest to recognize that and sort of not pretend that I'm very sensitive, having had a number of very personal discussions with Black people, folks in particular, and friends. At first I recognized that I was sort of like treating this too academically and treating this too almost like I was excited about it. Like, oh, isn't this a fun thing to learn about?
Yeah, let's go solve it.
Yeah, this is my lived experience and it sucks. And not just be so smiley about it. I'm like, okay, that was a good lesson to learn.
Yeah. No, it's healing.
They are there. Those feelings are there, and we recognize them.
We need healing. Well, we need healing on all levels, man. We need internal healing. I think that's the root, personally, is the internal healing leading to external healing. But it's easy. I know I focus on it sometimes to my own detriment, focus on external healing over internal healing because it seems more energizing. Well, we all need it both.
And that's
both, man.
I couldn't agree more. I think all roads hopefully do lead to healing, and
we're all responsible for each other's healing, guys. I'm going to put that on all of you, for our own and for everybody else's. We're a community. We're all together, not just for our groups, but for all of us. So the woundings, whether or not they're real or caused by a real thing, even the woundings is something I have to remind myself of, are to be attended to. Because even a psychosomatic injury is still an injury.
And I didn't sort of finish the whole chain of Dr. Rupa Mario's work, but she's a doctor, so it basically lands on trauma, and then it takes that even a layer deeper to inflammation. So again, something measurable. And I do remember we talked about this at some point. Well, lots of things cause inflammation. True.
Yeah.
So the question is, how much inflammation or health disorders are indeed caused by systemic factors? You know, that's a question worth attempting to answer, as so many.
I'd love to know. As a sufferer of ulcerative colitis, I certainly would love to know the answer to that question.
But that just, to me, validates what you just said. The thing that is needed across all of this is healing.
Yeah.
And I find these conversations with you to be part of my, not only exploration, but part of my healing, because I do believe we get closer to truth.
Yeah. Well, I love you very much. And I love hearing your heart poured out of your mouth, man.
I love you, and I'll see you soon.
Bye.